here's some fundamental rules about the shadow that you might think about as you move forward through your life. So a lot of times you're going to have to negotiate on your own behalf. And so what that means from the perspective of agreeableness and aggression is that you should be able to stand up for yourself at least as well as you would stand up for someone that you care for. So the problem with the idea of being nice to other people is that it doesn't take you into account, and that's supposed to be an equation, even though it's, as I said, nice is a pretty weak philosophical term. But the fundamental rule is that you should certainly include yourself in the circle of people who deserve respect and care, and that means that you have to be willing to advocate for yourself, and if you're willing to advocate for yourself and you want to do it, you have to be able to say no. You have to, because otherwise you have to say yes, and then you can't negotiate. And in order to say no, you have to have armed yourself with strategies and plans that enable you to say no. You can't be dependent. You can't be afraid of potentially searching out new opportunities, etc. You have to be willing to stand your ground. And it's very difficult to do that without drawing on some of the deeper sources of psychological energy that are part of our psychophysiological heritage. So Jung would say, well, there's the persona and the ego, and you can identify with your persona, and then you're kind of a shallow puppet of culture. So Pinocchio as the marionette is a persona. Pinocchio himself is an ego, but as a marionette, he's the persona. So anybody who's ideologically possessed, by the way, is a persona. Although they're also possessed by the shadow, even though they don't know it. And you can tell when someone's ideologically possessed, because you can predict whatever they're going to say once you know a few axioms of their particular ideology. So a given ideology probably has 4 or 5 explanatory axioms, like everything is caused by economic disparity, that might be one, or success is due to hard work, that might be another. And those are broad enough statements, even though they're in opposition to one another. Both of those statements are broad enough so you can virtually explain everything with them. The problem with it is that you can predict what the explanation is going to be before you even have to talk to the person. And whenever you're talking to someone and you can predict exactly what they're going to say because they're using some ideologically mediated structure, then you know perfectly well that they've identified with the persona. You also know that they're likely to be possessed by a pretty vicious shadow, because we know that the shadow of ideological possession is repression and death. So one of the things that's always interesting about the psychoanalysts is that whenever they see something good, they're always looking for the dark side of it. And vice versa, by the way. Whenever they see anything dark, they're looking for the good side of it. And so they're very unlikely to take anything at face value. And so if someone comes up to you and says, I stand for some good thing, the thing that you ask if you're psychoanalytically minded is, well, what does that mean that you hate? Because there's a reasonable probability that even though you think that you're standing for something, that a lot of what's motivating you is the desire to be against something. And that's particularly the case when you're dealing with negative emotions, because they're more powerful than positive emotions. So it's one of the things, George Orwell, who was one of the 20th century's great anti-ideologues, published a book in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, called Road to Wigan Pier, where he went to stay with some coal miners in the north of England. And those coal miners, man, they had a hard life. Like, some of them had to crawl 3/4 of a mile to work in tunnels in the morning, in tunnels where they couldn't stand up, just to get to work. So, and then they do their like 10-hour shift in the coal mine, digging out coal, and then they'd have to crawl back 3/4 of a mile underground, you know. So they had very, very hard lives. And so, you know, Orwell was pretty unimpressed by the conditions in which they were forced to work. So he wrote an essay for the English Left Book Club, and that was a socialist publishing house, but he appended another essay to it where he criticized the socialists who were most likely to read that sort of book as much more oriented towards hating the rich than loving the poor. It was devastating criticism, and the Left Book Club didn't even want to publish his book, but they ended up publishing it. It's become a very famous essay, but it lays out a general principle. It's like, if you have identified with a given persona, which is like a social machine in a sense, and you think you're all good because of what you think, then you might ask, well, where do all the parts of you that aren't good go? Because unless you think that you're a saint and that everyone who thinks differently than you is Satan himself, then you're missing a chunk of yourself. You're not taking a chunk of yourself into account, and that's the part that is nowhere near as well behaved or as benevolent as you might think, or that you actually have any reason to believe. You know, and so one of the things that has struck me as a consequence of analyzing 20th century history, and often through a Jungian lens, is that there's not much evidence that the sorts of atrocities that characterized the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the result of a few extremely corrupt people at the top of the hierarchy forcing everyone down into slavery and then making them do terrible things. I think that's a very weak explanation. In fact, I think it's wrong. I think the historical record is quite clear that it's wrong. I mean, in East Germany, for example, 1/3 of the people were government informers. So that means if you had a family of 6, 2 of your family members were reporting on you to the government. So when you look at human capacity for destructiveness, if you don't regard yourself as one of the agents of that destructiveness, or at least one of the potential agents of that destructiveness, then from the Jungian perspective at least, there's a high probability that you're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be blamed for it, because blame has to come from another person, and it isn't obviously clear that, like, I get to blame you for being potentially violent. That, I think, is a complete mistake. But if you familiarize yourself with the realm of human capability, and then you regard yourself as human, what that means is that you have to regard yourself as a creature that's capable of what human beings are capable of. And human beings are capable of a lot of things, and some of them are absolutely wonderful. I mean, there's nothing more remarkable than a human being on the planet. I mean, people can do amazing things, but the downside of that is that we can do absolutely horrible things, and it's not obvious that it's only the pathological people who do that. In fact, it's not reasonable to assume that. So the shadow for Jung was a very big deal, you know, and he believed in some sense, and this is where the ideas get archetypal, he believed that the ideas of the evil twin of the king, or the evil twin of God for that matter, so that would be Satan in Christian theology, that was as real a representation of the human and transpersonal human capacity for evil as there was. And he believed that if you looked deep enough into your own foul motivations, and if you looked far enough down, that you'd be looking, so to speak, into hell itself, and you'd find the main controller of hell deep inside your psyche. So it was no journey for the timid. And Jung also believed that, and this is what separates him from a New Age thinker, because he's often accused of being a New Age thinker. New Age thinkers tell you things like follow your bliss and you'll run into utopia, you'll encounter utopia. But that isn't what the Jungians, especially Jung, said about his process of individuation at all. He said that if you follow what's meaningful and you do it honestly, it will take you somewhere you really do not want to go. And until you go there, you'll never be able to climb up higher on the other side. And so that provides a real impediment for enlightenment, because for enlightenment there's a price to be paid. And if you look at archetypal representations of the cost of enlightenment, you often find that the person who becomes enlightened is damaged in some profound way before it happens. So for example, in the ancient Egyptian stories of Horus and Osiris, Horus loses an eye when he has to encounter Set, who's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Satan. So it's no joke. It's seriously no joke